Hi, my name is Josh White, and this is my presentation on the Bracero program. So, my research question that I'm asking is: was the Bracero program mutually beneficial for the U.S. and the Mexican citizens slash Braceros who were providing the labor? And then a follow up point that I wanted to answer is: was the agreement detailed within the Bracero program fair, and was it upheld properly? So, let's just get right into this. So I'm going to start with giving you some background on the agreement itself of the Bracero program between the United States and Mexico. So some background. Bracero is a Spanish term that means one who works using their arms. So basically, Braceros were manual laborers contracted by the U.S. government to help fill the increasing demand for labor. Braceros were contracted to help build railroads and also work on farms. Recruitment for railroad laborers did not last long, making the sole purpose for braceros to help fulfill agricultural demands. This labor shortage could be attributed to World War II and the large amounts of U.S. citizens that were called upon to fight or serve. World War II took place from 1939 until 1945, with bracero recruitment first starting in 1942. So, as you guys can see, the time period when Bracero recruitment started directly aligns with the middle of World War II when we were at our lowest amount of domestic labor. So we were at a huge labor shortage. So just more background. The main motives of the U.S. regarding this agreement was to help fill the labor shortage within the agricultural industry. Filling the shortage was essential to maintain war efforts of World War II and to prevent a food shortage similar to what occurred during the Great Depression and World War I. Roosevelt, the president at the time, was under a great deal of pressure to maintain the economic value of domestic agriculture due to its substantial influence on the people of the 1940s. This was due to the fact that the U.S. is a democratic government where Roosevelt's re-election and approval ratings were to a great extent dependent on the economic success of the citizens. So in the 1940s, almost 22% of the American citizens lived on farms, while today only around 3% do. That just shows that almost a quarter of American citizens were dependent on income from farms. So Roosevelt wanted to make these people happy because that was a big interest of our nation and a big economic support of our nation. This shows the immense economic importance of supporting farmers by providing them with contracted workers. Roosevelt also wanted to align the United States and Allied forces with that of the Mexican government in hopes that this agreement would help to develop better relationships and ultimately deter the spread of communism to Mexico. So there was three main reasons on why we made this agreement with Mexico. So the Bracero program took place between the U.S. and Mexico, as stated before, and consisted of multiple laws and agreements. This program lasted a total of 22 years and lasted from 1942 until 1964. This program was initially designed to serve as a wartime relief measure, but continued for many years after the conclusion of World War II. We're going to get into this more in a little bit, but the reason it continued after World War II was because of how beneficial it was for the farmers, because they were able to receive cheap labor at a fraction of the price, and it was mainly stoop labor, which meant that it was undesirable and that it was hard labor that nobody else really wanted to do. So the initial agreement took place on August 4th, 1942, with the signing of the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement. This agreement promised that Mexican contract workers would not engage in U.S. military service. So basically, since they're not citizens of the United States, they can't join our military service. Mexicans entering the U.S. under provisions of the agreement would not be subjected to discriminatory acts, so they could not be discriminated against. Race should not play a part. So that was just mainly to prevent lack of pay due to their race, racial discrimination, things like that. Workers would be guaranteed transportation, living expenses, and reparations along the lines established under Article 29 of Mexican labor laws. So this basically just meant that they would have everything paid for them, all the basic needs of life would be taken care of, and they would not have to worry about those things, that the employers would have to worry about those things for them. And then finally, that Mexicans entering under the agreement would not be employed either to displace domestic workers or to reduce their wages. So this was basically just protecting American jobs, and basically, like, if there was a strike, you couldn't just hire a bunch of braceros to replace the people on strike. So unfortunately for the braceros, these guidelines were poorly followed. So this ties into one of the research questions. So farmers found ways to exploit these government-enforced policies. Many farmers manufactured labor shortages in order to contract braceros at low wages. In order to contract braceros, a farmer had to first prove a labor shortage. In doing so, they had to advertise the position through local U.S. Employment Services offices. The farmer would advertise undesirable stoop labor jobs, which were very demanding and labor intensive, at wages that no domestic workers would accept. Due to these conditions, insufficient domestic workers would respond to the ads, and the local government officials would approve the shortages due to their personal relationships with the farmers. With this, farmers would obtain contracted braceros at unfair wages. So basically, there was a huge political aspect to what was going on, and that they were able to take advantage of the system and get cheaper labor by manufacturing these shortages. Even though they weren't really true, they just weren't offering high enough wages. Mainly because this was taking place after the war. A lot of it continued even after the war, after there was no longer a shortage. So that's how they continued to get these cheaper prices. But during the war, there was a shortage. But still, they were able to get the braceros at much cheaper prices. So due to the poor conditions already discussed, Mexico refused to provide enough braceros to maintain the post-war demands of 1947. Due to this lack of braceros, growers turned to illegal immigrants to fill this need for labor. Conditions for Mexican workers continued to worsen because they were unregulated, and these illegals were not under the Bracero program agreements. So the government really had no way of telling what was going on. So the conditions worsened even worse than they already were. So in 1951, the U.S. and Mexico finally reached a more lasting foundation for the Bracero program. This new Bracero program was made up of a standard work contract between grower associations and braceros, an international agreement, and Public Law 78. The new Bracero program also failed due to the same reasons of its predecessors. This failure was due to the fact that it still relied on local and state officials who were easily influenced by growers. So this new program was supposed to be more strict and have more government involvement on the U.S. side to ensure that these agreements were upheld, but in reality they just failed again due to the influence by growers on local and state governments. Under the Eisenhower administration, agreements with the new Mexican president Adolfo Ruiz Cortines could not be reached. Due to this lack of agreement, unilateral recruitment of braceros took place. This led to thousands of braceros rushing the border in hopes of work. As a result, mass chaos broke out and negotiations reopened. A new end date of 1955 was negotiated for the Bracero program. Due to the large amounts of undocumented and illegal aliens that had crossed the border, the need for legal, documented, and regulated braceros greatly declined. Issue Operation Wetback 1954 to 1955 INS was put in place in order to secure our border and deport hundreds of thousands of undocumented workers. This mass deportation revitalized the Bracero program and made it the primary method of obtaining laborers. So the U.S. purposely put this program in place to revitalize the program because undocumented aliens were taking all these jobs that were open for Bracero program legal workers, not illegal workers like illegal aliens. So throughout the remainder of the Bracero program, wages and conditions promised for these workers improved slightly. However, support for the contracted work fell greatly due to its economic effects. on the American people. Growers benefited immensely due to the cheap labor, but other Americans were left jobless. Eventually, through increased disapproval by the American public in documentaries such as The Harvest of Shame, the Bracero program ended in 1964 in order to restore these jobs to the American people. So, getting to our research questions and to answer them, why was the Bracero program mutually beneficial for the U.S. and the Mexican citizens slash Braceros who were providing the labor? To answer this question, we must first ask, did Braceros benefit from this agreement? The answer to this question is yes. This is due to the fact that Mexico lacked economic opportunity. Even with Braceros being underpaid and having to live in inhumane environments, sadly they were still better off than they would have been if they stayed in Mexico. This can be proven by the fact that Mexican citizens continued to pursue work as Braceros even though the working conditions were poor. This can be seen evident earlier in the presentations when we talked about the unilateral pursuit of the U.S. to get these workers and how they rushed the Mexican border to try and get across, even though the Mexican government was trying to prevent them from crossing. That just shows how much they wanted to work. The United States did not uphold their promised agreement due to the government's inability to regulate the agricultural industry. Braceros were underpaid, racially discriminated against, received poor medical attention, cheap food, and even had to often pay for transportation to work. All of these aspects were supposed to be covered under the agreement, but unfortunately, growers decided the conditions in which Braceros would work. Even though the Braceros' basic rights and agreements were not upheld, they still benefited due to the fact of how poor living conditions were in Mexico. What the U.S. did to Braceros was not morally correct, but in the end it still benefited them. In regard to the U.S., the Bracero program had much more benefits than disadvantages. It provided the U.S. with a workforce during World War II and also made farmers very rich. The Braceros also did the jobs that most Americans didn't want to do, and they did them for a fraction of the price. Finally, when the U.S. decided that we wanted to return those jobs back to American citizens, we ended the Bracero program. This proves that the U.S. benefited from the Bracero program. We can conclude that both Mexico and U.S. mutually benefited from the Bracero program. So now on to the follow-up question. So the follow-up question was, the agreement detailed within the Bracero program fair, and was it upheld properly? Upon review of the Bracero program, it is clear that the agreement detailed within was fair. The Braceros were guaranteed prevailing wages, those paid to Americans for the same work, medical attention. They would not be subjected to discriminatory acts. Workers would be guaranteed transportations, living expenses, and all other basic human necessities free of charge. This agreement was clearly fair and would even be deemed generous by most. With this, the answer to the first part of the question is yes. We know this agreement was not upheld properly due to the inability of the government to regulate and control the conditions in which the Braceros worked. Through the conduction of thousands of interviews, documentation, and journals regarding the conditions, we know that the treatment of Braceros did not comply with the agreements made. There are documented pictures depicting specific housing for Mexicans, whites, and blacks in order to keep the three groups separate due to racism. In interviews, former Braceros explained how they were taken advantage of in regard to the wages in which they were paid. This statement has been proven throughout the slideshow and is evident by the manufactured labor shortages by growers, which allowed them to contract Braceros at low cost. Every Bracero experienced a different environment depending on their grower, but in most cases they were taken advantage of, and the agreement made was not upheld properly. Some growers required them to pay for transportation, some did not. Some did not provide proper medical attention, and most provided cheap food for the Braceros. In conclusion, it's clear that the original agreement of the Bracero program was fair, but due to a failed system, the agreement was not upheld. And here's my works cited, and thank you.